After a decade of development and project restarts, the latest Dragon Age is finally here. Dragon Age: The Veilguard is a direct sequel to 2014's Inquisition, and uses an evolution of that game's Frostbite technology, featuring ray tracing techniques and current-gen exclusivity. But with that advanced rendering tech, how does the game scale to more conservative console hardware, especially the 4 teraflop Series S? And how have the game's ray tracing settings been adapted for console play? Dragon Age: The Veilguard is a great looking game. I wasn't all that taken by early previews, but with the game actually in hand, I think it's clearly a very handsome title. There are some really beautiful environments here, with abundant foliage and attractive lighting. It's not necessarily going to stand toe-to-toe with this generation's top tier in terms of reflections or diffuse GI quality, but the overall image looks pretty sound. One element that highlights the experience is the game's strand-based hair system, which looks stunning on the PS5 here. The developers have taken and adapted Frostbite's hair system here, which provides an impressive combination of refined hair detail with realistic movement and flow. In virtually any gameplay or cutscene situation, my character's long curled locks produced a visually satisfying result with minimal clipping, and that applies to essentially all the hair featured in the game, regardless of length or texture. That hair is featured quite nicely in the game's character creator, which provides a lot of options for character designs without feeling overwhelming. The rounded off, exaggerated features here ensure the characters don't dip into the uncanny valley. It's a little more guided than creating a character in a Bethesda game, but I feel like it provides a similar level of flexibility, and of course it's easy to skip through if you just don't care. Veilguard's stylization is likely to be a little bit controversial, as the cartoonish faces do stick out slightly, but it did grow on me over the course of my gameplay. For more information on the visuals, I'd advise checking out Alex's PC review from earlier this week. Today we're just here to talk about the console versions, which we'll take a look at starting with the PS5. The PS5 has 2 visual modes in Veilguard, a fairly customary fidelity mode and performance mode, which target 30 FPS and 60 FPS respectively. For resolutions, we're looking at pretty typical FSR2 targets, with the fidelity mode usually running at or around 1080p and the performance mode coming in around 720p. At a minimum, I counted 504p in the performance mode, so there is some dynamic res here, although the fidelity mode held at 1080p in my testing. From those internal figures, BioWare is using a customized version of FSR 2.2 to bring the game to higher resolutions, likely around 4K for the fidelity mode and 1440p for the performance mode, at least judging by comparisons to the PC code. In practice, I think this works fairly well. You still get some of that classic FSR2 fizzle in motion, but it's less obvious than in a lot of other games that use the technique. Image stability at rest is generally fine, and when moving through a scene it's not too bad either. The technique is stressed most in fast action combat, where complex movement and particles do create issues for FSR, but even when there's a little bit of breakup, it never looks particularly offensive. The fidelity mode is cleaner overall, though the performance mode's doubled refresh helps to keep disocclusion issues to a minimum. Outside of image quality, the other key difference between the 2 modes is the presence or absence of ray tracing, specifically RT reflections and RTAO, which are featured in the fidelity mode exclusively. The RT reflections can make a pretty big difference in some scenes, adding a level of depth and lighting accuracy to a scene that can't be replicated with cube maps or SSR. RT reflections are frequently applied to water, and sometimes make an appearance on glossy materials like metals. These reflections appear to run using the PC's selective RT setting, so they don't necessarily apply broadly across all bodies of water or suitably glossy surfaces. In practice, this means you see a slightly inconsistent depiction of reflective detail. This lake, for instance, gets the RT reflections treatment in the fidelity mode, fixing some oddly misaligned reflections in the performance mode and providing better reflections on this rough water. But on this river, we get the same cube maps as the performance mode, which don't look that great. It's definitely an interesting approach to console optimization, but some of these gaps in reflections coverage do look a little bit odd. Interestingly, when we look at the PC code with RT reflections turned on, some areas do appear to offer much less reflective detail than others. This interior scene has pretty intricate reflections that depict the scene accurately, for instance, while this area features similar reflective detail that's only depicted in screen space. The second area doesn't have RT reflections at all with the selective RT setting, so certain areas may be prioritized with a more comprehensive BVH. The RTAO doesn't seem to be prioritized quite as well though. Take this scene for instance. Adding RTAO on PC greatly diminishes the appearance of light leak through these barrels, but the selective PC RTAO setting and the PS5 Fidelity mode don't add RTAO in this area. Likewise with this vase, where the PC's RTAO is the only way to fix the glow here. The visual impact can be pretty substantial, but only high-end PC can take proper advantage. I never spotted an area with both RTAO and RT reflections clearly visible at the same time on PS5, so it may be the case that one or the other is simply disabled at a time. I did spot what appears to be RTAO in the game's second area. Underneath these boards, for instance, the PS5 Fidelity mode offers a slightly deeper depiction of shade than the performance offering, but SSAO still appears to be present here, and the impact of RTAO is still a little limited relative to what we'd usually see. The improvement over performance mode is pretty subtle. The overall difference between the Fidelity mode's apparent RTAO and the SSAO only performance mode is quite limited, I'd say, with the RT reflections offering a greater visual distinction. Still, the overall delta in lighting quality between the performance and Fidelity modes isn't that great. Outside of the RT, the Fidelity mode appears to use a slightly higher SSAO setting and brighter shadows, which sometimes exhibit more diffuse filtering. Level of detail settings also appear more refined in that 30 FPS mode. Outside of those tweaks, there's not much to separate the two modes visually outside of resolution. Performance-wise, the story is pretty simple. The Fidelity mode is pretty much a locked 30 FPS, at least in my experience. There's no frame pacing weirdness here, and the game does a good job landing a consistent 30. It's possible the game may have slightly bigger issues later on, but I didn't encounter any problems in earlier sections. The performance mode is mostly a 60 FPS experience, but it does struggle slightly with periodic framerate drops, which tend to occur in certain cutscenes and environments. Demanding combat moments can also cause a brief dip here and there. It's not a perfect 60 FPS, and you can feel those frame time intrusions occur a little more often than I'd like, but it's a pretty good performance level on the whole. With PS5 out of the way, let's move on to Xbox. Series X, unsurprisingly, is just about identical to PS5, running at very similar settings. Fidelity and performance clock in at 1080p and 720p respectively in my counts in typical play, with the performance mode at a minimum of 504p and the fidelity mode again holding at 1080p. Ray tracing is featured in the fidelity mode and absent in the performance mode, and other visual settings across the modes appear similar to PS5 as well. Series S is a bit more interesting. We get the same visual toggles as the other consoles, a performance and a fidelity mode. The fidelity mode runs at about 648p internally typically, with a visual output that looks noticeably softer and noisier than the other console's performance modes. Performance mode goes down to roughly 432p internally usually, outputting at something that looks close to 1080p to my eyes. I wasn't actually able to spot any resolution variance on the Series S, even when the game was dropping frames, suggesting that the junior Microsoft console may be holding on to its resolution figures more tightly than the other machines. Both modes suffer from extra breakup relative to the other consoles, and don't hold up super well on a 4K TV set. It's not nearly as dire as the internal resolutions would suggest, as FSR is greatly upgrading the imagery, but it isn't a foolproof solution at very low resolutions. Series S, unsurprisingly, also drops the ray tracing entirely, with no RT visible in the fidelity mode. The game's superb strand-based hair also doesn't make the cut, with the Series S getting by with less fluid and less detailed hair cards instead. Other settings look similar to the other console's performance modes. Performance on Series X is pretty good. Again, the 30 FPS mode runs with a locked frame rate, outside of one brief cutscene moment I spotted in the game's first area. The performance mode runs very similarly to PS5, suffering framerate drops in the same moments with a similar magnitude. It's a good experience on the whole, but it does have some slight rough edges in that performance mode on a conventionally refreshed display. You may notice some screen tearing here, as both Xbox Series machines can tear selectively in the top portion of the screen when they go over budget, with the use of an adaptive VSync system. The PS5 is technically able to do the same, but the portion of the screen where tearing is permitted appears to be much smaller, so the game runs with full VSync the overwhelming majority of the time. Series S delivers a solid 30 FPS refresh in fidelity mode, again roughly matching the other consoles. The performance mode, though, is a little less stable, dipping below 60 FPS more frequently while traversing environments and watching cutscenes. It mostly runs at a decent enough performance level, it's just not quite up to the standards of the other console platforms. Overall, I'm quite pleased with Dragon Age the Veilguard. It seems especially well calibrated for consoles, relying on a selective RT implementation to avoid stressing the console's GPUs, and delivering decent image quality and good performance. It's a more console-friendly experience than many other big-budget games this year, though it's not perfect either. On PS5 and Series X, I have a preference for the performance mode, which delivers most of the game's visual appeal at a reasonably good 60 FPS update. There are a number of nips and tucks, but none that have a big impact on the experience, and image quality is generally fine sitting a normal distance from a 4K TV. Plus, VRR helps iron out any dips if you have an appropriate display, and eliminates tearing. On Series S, I think the choice is less clear. The fidelity mode offers more reasonable image quality at a consistent 30 FPS, while the performance mode has to make do with a much more compromised image at a less stable 60. I'd usually take the 30 FPS option in these circumstances, but Dragon Age doesn't have much motion blur, which makes the 30 FPS option a bit less smooth feeling than I would like. Considering the hardware though, it's a perfectly good experience, especially considering many other Series S efforts drop high performance modes entirely. I don't think Dragon Age fans will be disappointed with Veilguard, and I don't think console gamers will either. BioWare's latest RPG is a solid experience on current-gen console hardware. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at digitalfoundry.net for exclusive and early access content and to get in touch use social media. Thanks for watching.